Well, good evening. It really is a pleasure to be back in Missoula. I've been here several times to give lectures, look up at the great white M in the sky, and always know it's there. I guess it's sort of the deity of the valley here, the great M in the sky. I've been in other buildings before, so this is my first experience in this underground room, and it's a pleasure to have so many of you come out tonight. Phil gave me a long list of topics to cover tonight, and I'm going to try to cover them all. From Montana to water in the United States generally, the arid lands, China, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know much about China, but I've been told that in Missoula, they ask you to do anything, and you do it. Steve tells me that he's worked on Korean masks, didn't know anything about it before, so in that spirit, I know you'll allow me to get away with quite a bit tonight. But I do want to introduce some ideas that I think Americans ought to be thinking about in terms of water control from China. So I'm going to talk a little bit about empire at the outset, and then talk about China and the United States in terms of our attitudes toward water and our policies and our history of water development. And then I'm going to come back and talk at the end about where all that leaves us today as far as water policy is concerned. What options do we have available to us? And at that point, you'll probably throw me out. I will try to work up some hope in the next 50 minutes, but I'm not promising you that you will go out of here cheering and celebrating the possibilities of change. Empire. Americans have, I think, a funny reaction to this word empire. Politically speaking, it's a dirty word. Empires are the enemies of this republic, from the founding fathers down to Patrick Buchanan. Political writers have labeled empires as aggressive, power-hungry, oppressive, undemocratic, and particularly in the case of the Russian Empire, dark and evil. Our popular story of how we came to be as a people has us coming out of empire, liberating ourselves from Britain's corrupt, abusive empire. We are still, I think, in our own eyes, both the liberated and the liberators, now fighting on behalf of other people struggling to get free of empires. Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev. Set the people free. But in other ways, I think we admire and celebrate empire, especially when it is our own beloved American empire. From our birthday in Independence Hall, 1776, to the present, we have been building an empire, now one that has swept to global proportions. I think that is essentially the meaning of the vote in the U.S. Senate the other day on the Test Ban Treaty, defending the American empire with nuclear weapons. And as we expanded our reach globally, we've also attached the word empire to the North American landscape. I said this today to somebody about Americans feeling powerfully positive about empire, and she was incredulous. But I reminded her of the way in which we put this word empire on our landscape. The Empire State Building, remember? The Rocky Mountain Empire, centered, of course, in Denver. The Inland Empire, centered in the great metropolis of Spokane. Imperial Valley on the Mexico-California border. You can go on and on across this landscape. Clearly, building and defending the American empire has become, in the words of an historian, William Appleman Williams, the American way of life. Now, this apparent contradiction, I think we try to reconcile by believing that our own empire is the great exception. Other empires have been unprincipled. Ours has principles. We represent virtue and enlightenment. And this is so because, and I want to make this critical point tonight, this is my critical point. Ours is regarded mainly as an empire over nature. That is, we've gone out with benevolent hearts into the wilderness to achieve an empire. We've laid tribute to ecosystems instead of other nations, making ecosystems pay a tax to support the American way of life. Bad empires conquer other nations. Good empires conquer nature. And this, I think, is how we reconcile these conflicts. Now, this distinction, if you think about it for a moment, is pretty shaky. In the first place, Americans have, in fact, subjugated other peoples to our rule. Native Americans come to mind. The power of unequal economic relations has left many people outside our national borders feeling like colonies of the United States. But the distinction is also shaky for this reason. All empires, I think, throughout history, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the Russian Empire, the Chinese Empire, have tried to establish power over nature. We're not unique in this respect. It's impossible to isolate the ecological empire from the political empire. That is, all empires want more land, they want more resources to consume, to draw tribute, commodities, and so forth. We're no exception in this regard. Tonight I want to examine briefly the world's two greatest surviving empires, the United States and China, and focus on their approach to one critical dimension of nature, the flow of water, the source of life itself. One of those empires has been conquering nature, conquering water, for a couple thousand years and more, and the other for less than a couple of centuries. Both have attempted, and both have succeeded in radically transforming their rivers and other waterways. Both regimes, I want to suggest tonight, are probably destined to last a long time. And we need to know what their history of conquest over water has been and what that history will allow them to do with their water resources in the future. The pursuit of empire, I'm going to argue tonight, is a trap as well as a gateway. Here's my China part. Phil West doesn't have to listen to this part. A little over a year ago, I came down the great Yangtze River of China on a Chinese tourist boat, not the boat that the German tourists were taking, which was very flashy, but a boat like one of these. This was just a few weeks before the devastating summer floods of 1998. The Yangtze River is one of the three longest rivers in the world and one of the three most voluminous. Its average discharge into the sea is some 35,000 cubic meters per second. I'm not doing anything to this, and it's jumping. I understand it's voice activated. I don't know what I'm supposed to not say. Maybe it's the great M in the sky or something. That's. Let me go back for just a minute, because these are sort of sequenced. I mean, they're basically just to give you a diversion to rest your eyes on for a little while. I don't think they have any deep informative purpose here, but I'd like to sort of keep them in order. Anyway, the average discharge of this enormous, third largest river in the world is 35,000 cubic meters per second, an average that obviously it is at times far exceeded. Much of this flow, however, is silt, and that's what the last picture was supposed to really represent for you. I think you can see something of the color of this river through this, loaded with mud. Already at the port city of Chongqing, where we came aboard our boat, the river is thick with mud, the residues of soil erosion, as well as chemical pollutants, and it becomes more turbid and more polluted as it flows down the 300 miles plus to Yichang, where we left the boat. I came by this very slow and by no means elegant mode of travel to see the fabled Three Gorges before they are inundated by the massive Three Gorges Dam, which is being completed near Yichang. I wanted to see these green mountains rising up from the water, the hillside towns along the way, many of them now emptied. The construction site itself, which is a city of 50,000 workers assembled to complete this project. Now, as announced, tomorrow night you're going to hear a real expert on this dam project. Tonight, my point is simply this. The Three Gorges Dam, it seems to me, from what I have read of Chinese history, is nothing new. I mean, it emerges out of 2,000 years and more of Chinese history. Behind its construction lies a strong cultural momentum, a tradition, a logic. Three Gorges, in fact, is only the latest feat in a long series of Chinese efforts to control the flow of water. For an American, China's record of water engineering offers several striking parallels. I can't think of another country, in fact, in the world that seems closer to our own in the scale of water engineering or the scale of ambitions. In the fourth volume of his enormous work, Science and Civilization in China, published in 1971, the Cambridge historian Joseph Needham declared, and I quote, "The story of the hydraulic works, that is engineering, water engineering, of China is nothing short of an epic." To him, it was at the heart of Chinese technological civilization. Before the 19th century, he argues, no country, no empire anywhere could match China's ability to control and manage its surface water. Now, among the many available maps of China, this one, which comes from Needham's book, is very interesting, it seems to me, for anyone living in the arid west of the United States. It shows a country slightly larger than ours, 3.7 million square miles compared to our 3.6 million square miles. And as in the United States, there's a very powerful isohyetl, or a rainfall line, dividing the country into two halves. I think you can probably see that okay. Is it clear from the back? Can you see what I'm talking about? This is what I'm particularly interested in, this rainfall line of 20 inches of rainfall, which you can see basically divides the country in half, the dry area and the rainy or wet area. In the United States, we have exactly the same line, but it runs north-south, up and down the Great Plains through Dodge City, Kansas. This is the famous 20-inch rainfall line which John Wesley Powell, in the 19th century, pointed out, this is more than a century ago, separates an area that can grow crops without irrigation from an area that depends on irrigation, where irrigation is required. Actually, as far as rice is concerned, the most important grain crop in China, the 30-inch rainfall line, I understand, is probably the more important, which marks the effective northern limit of wet rice cultivation. Whatever line we choose, beyond them lies a China that is dry, a country where some wheat and millet can be grown without irrigation, but where drought is common and human starvation an old specter. Fortunately, the Chinese possess several great rivers that flow through or near this subhumid country, and they have constructed an artificial river to bind together these wet and dry regions. It's not too much to say that controlling these rivers, overcoming the critical problem presented by nature, has been the foundation of China's expansion and China's stability. A long series of dynasties have come and gone, each contributing to the water control system, with, I think, the present communist government representing the latest of those regimes. After the Yangtze, the second major river of the country, and one which lies completely in the dry region, is the Yellow River. It's not marked on this, but I'm not going to try to find it on here. But it begins up on the Qinghai Plateau and drains a basin which is roughly 3 times the size that drained by the Colorado River. Much of its upper and middle basin consists of highly erodible loess soils, and thus the river carries a huge load of silt, far larger than the Yangtze. This silt it deposits downstream, raising the bed of the river year by year. It has over much of the past. Though its flow is seldom very large, and like the Colorado River, has been almost totally appropriated, year by year it has been a dangerous river. It has never wanted to stay put in its bed, shifting back and forth in its channel. The core areas of the Chinese state first emerged in this Yellow River Valley, particularly in the stretch that lies immediately to the west and the east of the ancient capital of Xi'an. The lessons that state rulers learned early on was one that I think China's rulers are still following today. If you want to gain and hold power over the people, you must gain and hold power over the natural environment. Floods must be controlled. Droughts must be mitigated. Dry lands must be irrigated. Nature, in short, must be subdued. Joseph Needham, in the book I just mentioned, quotes from Quan Tzu, a tome which dates back to the 2nd or 3rd century BC, which urges rulers to overcome the harmful influences of water. And I quote, "A river running wild injures men. When it injures men, there arises great distress among them. In great distress, they treat the laws lightly. Laws being treated lightly, it is difficult to maintain good order. Good order lapsing, filial piety disappears. And when people have lost filial piety, they are no longer submissive." Now, I think there you have in a hoary nutshell the lesson that all imperial states seek to absorb and to use to their advantage. A law-abiding, stable, and yes, submissive population cannot be achieved without controlling the wildness and the lawlessness of water flowing across the land. I'll just mention one more item here, and I think I'll see if I can make this go forward. We can't review all the achievements of the Chinese water control, ancient, modern, and so on. But one especially monumental project has to be mentioned, the Grand Canal, which took hundreds of years to complete and was complete by around AD 1300. Also known as the Traffic River, it was a man-made waterway that ran from Hangzhou, Shanghai area, north to Beijing. It's over 1,000 miles long. The greatest man-made waterway in the world before the 20th century. In places, it was as deep as 30 feet, and it could carry very large boats, heavily laden with grain demanded by the imperial authorities in Beijing. Essentially, it was a way of moving taxes, however, from the wet area to the dry area as a form of tribute. Well, it's common knowledge, I think, too, that despite these imperial triumphs over nature, China eventually fell victim to invaders from Europe and fell into a slew of poverty and malnutrition that finally brought on the Communist Revolution of 1949. Water control clearly was not always sufficient to keep the empire safe from its enemies, or to keep good order, or to keep a submissive populace. Yet until the 20th century, no other nation could show such impressive achievements in hydraulic engineering. Even France, which was the established leader in Europe, as late as the 1890s, could not show canals as long or as large as the Grand Canal. And no other empire throughout human history has endured so long and so tenaciously as China's. The environmental foundation of that empire, I'm suggesting tonight, was the control of water. No one, to my knowledge, has placed this experience of China alongside that of the United States for comparison. And I'm going to very briefly sketch that tonight. It seems to me it would be worth several volumes to do this in justice, but I think it would reveal to us a lot about our own experience and raise some interesting questions. For one thing, it would show us that this country alone, of all modern nations, has surpassed the Chinese achievement. Our ability to control water on a large scale is stupendous, and it has come with astonishing speed, essentially in the 20th century. From a country that at the beginning had only the barest foothold on the Atlantic coast, we have moved to a water empire that is continental in scope. By the 20th century, the United States had come to define the global standard in water engineering, as China once did, and even China has come to emulate the United States, our example, for good or bad. What do you do when you are a tiny population about the size of Denmark, living along the Atlantic coast, strung out along the eastern tidewater? What do you do when you have freed yourself from one empire and are now ready to build an empire of your own? How do you begin? Well, the American answer, which went off like a flash bulb around 1800, was to think about rivers. How many rivers are there in North America? Was a question people began. Where do they go? What can they be made to do? Our early national history was from the beginning concentrated on water. Water. My throat's just full of antihistamines. The nation's first boundary was the Mississippi. And I think our first national priority, basically, was to get to the Mississippi and then get beyond the Mississippi. That's why the so-called Voyage of Lewis and Clark in 1804 was so important. It was a lot more than undaunted courage, Stephen Ambrose's title, or a military exercise. It was a vital public mission that expressed and defined the empire ambitions of this nation. Go down the Ohio to the Mississippi. Go up the Missouri to the Rockies, as far as you can. Look for a broad, watery highway to the Pacific that can connect the United States to what? The China trade. I mean, already Americans are thinking about connecting to the China trade under Thomas Jefferson. A tiny nation with these kinds of dreams of empire must not only explore its rivers for transportation, but also create a rich national mythology about rivers. It must encourage its writers, its poets, its songmakers, its artists to celebrate the flow of water across the continent. To draw the people's attention away from their daily lives and to begin to imagine what lies out beyond the frontier. It must develop a powerful feeling in people about those rivers, and we see this in a number of sources and places in our literature. This happens to be a photograph, and you can find dozens and dozens and thousands of ways in which Americans began to celebrate water in the landscape. This is actually taken in 1871, and it was taken by a photographer by the name of Beeman, who, I won't stay there. This is the Gates of Lodore on the Green River as it comes down from Wyoming into Utah, the site of Dinosaur National Monument today. And this figure sitting on the bank with his pipe contemplating this river, dreaming of rivers, is the point I want to make. And you can go on to look at other examples. This happens to be, this one isn't wanting to focus very well either. This is from the lower Colorado River, painted by a German, a steamboat going up the Colorado River in 1858. This is a painter by the name of Mulhausen, who was traveling along with an exploring expedition. Picture after picture of the lower Colorado River that was sold in the East to raise American imaginations about rivers. This is from the Hudson River School of Painters in the first half of the 19th century, and it's a painting of the Susquehanna River near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I wish I had this one in color, but you can sense the romantic, powerful feeling that Americans began to develop about rivers. Now, of course, that feeling can go in a number of directions, but I'm arguing that one of the directions this powerful feeling went was to send people out into the landscape, not only to the Susquehanna, but the Merrimack, the Cumberland, the Wabash, the Mississippi, with dreams of conquest in their minds. All the while, this nation was trying to figure out how to tie these rivers together into a common network that could support cities, industry, and commerce. That is, fill in the gaps in nature, beginning with the Erie Canal, which was finished in 1825, linking the Hudson River Valley to the Great Lakes. The United States began to fashion a water regime to rival ancient China's. By the middle of the 19th century, you could get from New York by water to the Mississippi by a multiplicity of routes, natural and artificial. Eventually, of course, what they did was to tie all these ecological regions of the United States into one consumer market. Eventually, the railroads displaced water, but I would suggest that even today, the American system of inland waterways, lakes, locks, dikes, still unites this country. Imagine what this country would look like if all of those waterways are filled in with dirt. Of course, we don't depend on the canals in the way we once did. Erie Canal still carries water, but it's not used for transportation. But if you stand at the ports of St. Louis, Chicago, Buffalo, you will realize how much we continue to depend upon water transport. Or stand at the man-made seaports of Lewiston, Idaho. Or, and this one particularly astonishes me, Tulsa, Oklahoma is a man-made seaport. Canals coming up the Kansas or the Arkansas River. We have turned Tulsa, Oklahoma into a seaport as part of the system. With the launching of the Tennessee Valley Project in the 1930s, we brought the American South into this nationwide system of waterways, so that Huntsville, Alabama, Chattanooga, Tennessee became ports of call. But the greatest challenge to this water empire of the United States came when the nation began to move farther west, beyond the 20th inch rainfall line, into the semi-arid and arid west, crossing the Great Plains, my country, my beloved country. If I can show you what rivers look like when you begin to move west of the 20th rainfall line. This is western Kansas. And there are people who love it, even if it isn't the Clark Fork flowing, etc. I've heard so much about the Clark Fork for the last 2 days, but it sort of breeds a certain reaction, in foreigners coming in here. Unlike China, the United States acquired and came to inhabit the arid part of our empire last. Our first core areas of empire were in the humid east. But when the empire got to the west, we were flummoxed, bewildered. Here, rivers tend to run part of the year, as in this case, or they run, I hope as this one shows, in deep canyons. How the hell do you get the water out of something like this and begin to make it useful? The water in this is, of course, relatively small by national standards. It's a mere trickle. But it was enough to encourage dreams of empire once more. The conquest of arid America is what I'm coming to. The conquest of arid America. It's a phrase that became the title of a book published in the year 1900 by a journalist, William Smythe. And in large part, this conquest of arid America is about the American water empire coming to the arid West, hesitating, then boldly entering, and then extravagantly building. Here's how Mr. Smythe in this book, 1900, writes. And just listen to the rhetoric and the dreams behind these words. The nation reaches its hand into the desert. The barred doors of the sleeping empire, there's the word, are flung wide open to the eager and the willing, that they may enter and claim their heritage. And it sounds religious. And I'm talking about a religion of the conquest of arid America. Montana, I must tell you, did not figure large in those dreams. Dreams of a paradise emerging out of the West. Smythe, in his book, gives this state fewer than 6 pages, less than any other Western state. California gets 40. Idaho even gets 12. Here's what Smythe writes. The opportunities which Montana offers to settlers have not been appreciated as they deserve. But then he goes on to point out winter temperatures falling 30 degrees below zero present conditions that even hydraulic engineering cannot overcome. Nonetheless, Mr. Smythe in the book The Conquest of Arid America, 1900, predicted a flowering in Montana of what he called legitimate agriculture to replace all the copper mines and illegitimate industry. Legitimate agriculture, that is, cultivating grains, fruit orchards, as quickly as irrigation could be developed. He writes, it would require vast expenditure for the construction of storage works and of long canals, but ultimately, he says, Montana can irrigate as many as 30 million acres if it uses its water resources. Now, I must tell you, he was a little optimistic. The 1992 Census of Agriculture tells us that there are less than 2 million acres, irrigated acres, in Montana today, which is a far cry from earlier expectations. I think it was probably in many ways a blessing, but Montana remained on the margins of the reclamation and the hydroelectric empire that Americans would create out of western rivers. The key areas of that effort, of course, are farther west, the Columbia River system, the Central Valley of California, down the Colorado River into the southwest, and so on. Development of those water resources in those areas would become the foundation of a powerful economy and a political order to rival that of the eastern states. It would also far surpass any desert regimes in human history in terms of capital investment, engineering expertise, agricultural production, industrial output, metropolitan growth. The milestones in this achievement all date, by the way, very recently, from the 1930s onward. That's how recent this Western irrigation and reclamation empire has been. It begins with the completion of Hoover Dam in 1935. Let's see if I can bring that up here. Well, which is within the lifetime of many older citizens in this country. This is when the great conquest really begins to leap forward. Standing 221 meters, 726 feet high, Hoover Dam was the first modern high-rise dam in the world. It occupies a position in the modern history of water engineering comparable to China's Grand Canal. Although it mainly helped stabilize the water supply, this was its intention for Imperial Valley in California and to prevent floods. Its main purpose was to generate electricity for Los Angeles and eventually for Las Vegas. This slide of Hoover Dam, illuminated by its own electricity, to me says a great deal about this country and our ambitions and our technology. I mean, it just sort of shimmers there in the blackness, like a religious icon. Well, come on. I've got a few more I want you to see. Now, I think this is probably the most photographed technological achievement in our society, the Hoover Dam with Lake Mead behind it. And as I said, its purpose was mainly this. Well, let's go back to that. It won't stay there. Los Angeles, several hundred miles across the desert, basically made possible in the early years its growth by this one dam on Hoover, at Hoover Dam. And this, Las Vegas, electrified river. And I particularly like this one, which tells us a great deal about our thinking about water and what we should be doing with it in this society. The Mirage in Las Vegas with these great fountains exploding. Now 1 million people living in Las Vegas on the basis of this river. Nature began to pay taxes to those building desert metropolises. Dam after dam has followed Hoover, and you know their names: Grand Coulee, Bonneville, Fort Peck, Garrison, Flaming Gorge, Glen Canyon, Oroville, Shasta, the list goes on and on. Today, the United States counts 50 major dams the size of Hoover. Over 5,000 large dams, slightly smaller, and about 100,000 dams in all. And they're distributed all over the country, from New England to the west, but mostly in the western states of the Tennessee Valley. They are concrete, rock, and earth expressions of the dominant ideology of the technological age. Icons of economic development and scientific progress to match nuclear bombs and motor cars. That's from Patrick Coulee in his book Silenced Rivers, The Ecology and Politics of Large Dams, which appeared last year. The economic benefits of this, I'm sure everybody here is aware of. I mean, we wouldn't be in rooms like this, enjoying the foundation support. We have the federal tax dollars we get. So much else in our lives. We wouldn't be living in the comfort we have today. We wouldn't have the opportunities to visit Las Vegas. All the other wonderful achievements that we have made in this country. The environmental cost of that empire have been, though, I think, as severe as the technological achievement has been impressive. Severe pollution of waterways has come in its wake. Devastation of freshwater fish and riparian habitat has occurred. The Missouri River, despite the stretch here in Montana under the Wild and Scenic Rivers legislation protection, downstream is rated number 1 on the nation's endangered rivers list. I've seen both ends, and they're both fascinating, but I think it's one of the remarkable facts of this country that we've taken something like the Missouri River and upstream made, 120 some miles of it, as it was in Lewis and Clark's day, Carl Bodmer's day, and downstream it's number 1 on the endangered rivers list. Despite these environmental costs, the model of American river development has moved outward from this continent to influence similar construction projects throughout the world. Where China remained for centuries a world unto itself with little impact elsewhere, the U.S. water regime has gone international. And now, astonishingly, the biggest dams, the biggest reservoirs, the biggest canals, and the biggest plans for the future are no longer found in the United States. Since around 1970, other countries have begun to surpass us in the scale of their ambitions. Hoover Dam has fallen to number 15 on the list of the world's highest dams. Higher structures have been constructed in Russia, Switzerland, India, Latin America. None of America's reservoirs now rank in the top 20 worldwide. In terms of hydroelectric generating capacity, Grand Coulee has dropped from 1st to 4th. The biggest are in Brazil, Paraguay, and Venezuela. And now the Three Gorges Dam in China is going to surpass all water projects anywhere. The wheel of history has come around, and China is once more taking the global lead in grandiose engineering and in environmental destruction. Today, there are some 36,000 large dams in the world. Virtually all of those built in this century. And they are so large and heavy together that they are having a measurable, perceptible impact on the rotation of the Earth on its axis. China has fully half of those dams, all built since 1949. Worldwide, an area the size of California has been inundated by reservoirs. Water has been made to cover floodplains, fertile farmlands, towns and cities, marshes, wetlands, whole forests. Clearly, the rest of the world has observed the incredible success that the United States has had in our short history, has observed what we've done with our rivers, and is determined to do the same. So, down the Ohio to the Mississippi, up the Missouri to the Rocky Mountains, down the Columbia to the Pacific, across the Pacific to China, India, Pakistan, Africa. Conquer, manage, control. We might compare empires to, change of pace for a moment, compare empires to the evolutionary history of the giant Saguaro cactus. The saguaro is an imposing structure, if you've seen one. These tall columns, branching columns, twisty limbs covered with spines. It's a plant that evolved to survive in places that gets less than 10 inches of rainfall a year. But the saguaro has never managed to do one thing. It's never been able to get over the Atlantic Ocean. And so you don't find a saguaro cactus, or any of the cactus family to my knowledge, in one place where they would grow very well, Africa. There are no saguaros in Zimbabwe. However, another genus of plants with radically different genetic origins a genus called the Euphorbia has evolved to fill the niche of the Saguaro cactus. It's like the saguaro, it's tall, it's fleshy, and it's able to store water in its tissues. For all practical purposes, the Euphorbia is a cactus for Africa. Why is he talking about that? I think something similar in cultural evolution happens when nations begin to strive toward the control of water. However different their cultural heritage may be, they begin to look remarkably like one another. A dam in China looks like a dam in America, and the dam builders look like one another too. All such empires develop hierarchies, divisions of power that are unequal and that are highly complicated. This hierarchy, I would suggest, is the inescapable result of accumulating the power needed to command water to flow where a nation wants it to go. If you want to do this sort of thing, you've got to accumulate a lot of power. Political, economic, and technological power, which leads, it seems to me, inevitably towards certain hierarchies within society. You have to mass a pool of labor. The slide that I didn't show you was essentially a corvée in China. Thousands of workers with shovels out there creating a canal. It requires the massing of sufficient technological expertise, knowledge, engineering skill. You can do these things if you've got a big enough wad of capital. However it's done, the structure of power is more or less the same, it seems to me. Large institutions with capital and expertise at their command appear to do the work of controlling water, like the saguaro, like the Euphorbia. They may wear the name of a government, or they may wear the name of a private corporation, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Imperial Irrigation District, the Bureau of Reclamation. They may speak English or Chinese. They may come out of different cultural heritages, but through convergent evolution, these agencies of water control are strikingly similar in their function and in their ideology. Now, this, again, I think is an unpalatable fact for Americans to live with. The idea that our empire might be similar to that of other countries. Somehow, our empire over nature was supposed to be unique, and nowhere more so than in the accumulation of power. That is, on this innocent continent, this blessed continent, the control of nature was supposed to remain magically in the control of the ordinary citizenry. Jane Sixpack and her husband Joe were supposed to be the real force behind the conquest. It was supposed to be their work, their achievement, their mastery. Let's get out of these disturbing waters of power and ask as a final question, what can we learn from history that will be useful for water policy today? What do China's dikes and levees, its Grand Canal, three gorges, say about that country's possibilities for the future? And what do our own dikes and levees, the California Aqueduct, Oroville Dam, reveal to us what it may be possible in our own watersheds and in their governance? In 1994, the commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation, Daniel Beard, remarked, "The dam building era in the United States is now over. The opportunity for any future prospects or future projects is extremely remote, if not non-existent." That was 1994. 40 years earlier, the Bureau of Reclamation and its commissioner was promising total control over water in the western United States. Total control for greater wealth was their slogan of the Bureau of Reclamation. Total control. Beard says the dam building era is over. Now note carefully, he didn't claim that the entire hydraulic apparatus is disappearing, that we're not going to be managing water anymore, controlling floods, channelizing streams, irrigating dry lands. He also did not point out that the dam building era is over largely because we have few sites left to dam. Nonetheless, these remarks by the Commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation thrilled many environmentalists who over the past couple of decades have grown increasingly critical of these old imperial attitudes. And now we've begun to hear from some environmentalists even more radical thoughts about water, rivers, and their uses. Let me give you some items randomly picked out of the newspapers. Item: the Missouri River, people are beginning to say, including Stephen Ambrose in Time magazine, should no longer be run merely as a barge canal, but should be restored to the rich natural habitat it had when Lewis and Clark first saw it. And the Army Corps of Engineers, which is mainly responsible for the lower river, has agreed to begin looking into restoring riparian wildlife habitat along this river. Item: a book appears from major university press with the title The Los Angeles River, yes, there is one, Its Life, Death, and Possible Rebirth. The author, who's a geographer at the University of Oklahoma, Blake Gumbrecht, writes that this river, deprived of its surface flow and kept in place by concrete. How many of you have seen the Los Angeles River? I mean, it's just this great concrete channel for flood control now and then, and there are highways going along and so on. This once was a little river that meandered through with vegetation, wildlife habitat, and so on. Gumbrecht writes that this river, which has been deprived of its surface flow and kept in place by concrete, is now hidden over most of its course by houses, factories, parking lots, and streets. And now a movement is afoot by a group called the Friends of the Los Angeles River to restore this river to a more natural state. Item: on July 1st of this year, one of the oldest dams in the United States came down, while the Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, a mayor, and a governor stood watching enthusiastically in the company of environmentalists, fishermen, television camera crews. The writer John McPhee was among this group, and in the September 27th issue of the New Yorker magazine, his essay entitled Farewell to the 19th Century records this interesting moment. The Edwards Dam, located on the Kennebec River near Augusta, Maine, was a small privately owned structure that generated a small amount of hydroelectricity. McPhee says it was not enough to light the warehouse at LL Bean. 162 years ago, a dam was first thrown across the rapids at this point. Instantly, it stopped the shad, that's a species of fish, from coming up the Kennebec River. No entry. The state of fish, there were probably as many as 1 million shad migrating up the Kennebec River before this dam was put in. Now a state official in Maine says that with this dam removed, most of that fish migration can be restored, and striped bass and Atlantic salmon can come back to the river too. Will the dawn of a reborn Kennebec River, liberated from the water empire after nearly 2 centuries of subjection, be on the horizon? Perhaps the boldest challenge to the water empire comes from those who want to begin tearing down dams. Essentially, they would add to Commissioner Beard's phrase, the end of the dam building era, the phrase, and now the dam removal era has begun. Mostly they are talking, it seems to me, about aging dams that would cost more to repair than remove. One target that is not so very old stands at the top of the list. Glen Canyon Dam on the Colorado, completed in 1963, drowning nearly 200 miles of sculpted canyons under the slack waters of Lake Powell. As incredible as it would have seemed in the 1960s, and still seems to Utah politicians, little knots of people are asking that Glen Canyon Dam, one of the leading icons of economic development, technological progress, be knocked down and the Colorado River restored to its ancient course. what are we going to make of these things happening around us, appearing in the newspapers? There's no predicting what's going to come of these straws in the wind, I think. Now and then, new ideas about nature do sweep through societies, like I like to think of them as microbes invading. And sometimes they become huge epidemics. They alter our ecology and technology, ideas that enter, and can do so with astonishing speed. We Americans like to believe that such radical change of direction is always possible and perhaps to be expected. We dislike the idea that the past, history, may confine us and control us. Why should our water history confine us or continue to enforce its mandates on us and the environment? Why not a new era, a revolution on the horizon? We boast that we are a creative and innovative society. We believe in revolutions. We celebrate what the economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. I mean, I think that's his description for capitalism, but I think it's a pretty good phrase for the American belief system. Creative destruction. We destroy to create in its place something new. And the speed with which we created a network of canals and then abandoned many of them with the coming of the railroad, and then abandoned the passenger railroad for the private automobile is certainly an example of creative destruction. Such a culture, a nation that constantly throws out new ideas, regularly discards our old ideas, and regards change and adaptation as the highest virtues, ought to be able, it would seem, to find radical alternatives to a water-controlling apparatus like a dam. I mean, if we can think up an alternative to a railroad in the way of an automobile, can we think up an alternative to a dam? It would seem that this is the American spirit. This is our challenge, or a barge canal. We ought to be able to bring back salmon in the old abundance. We ought to be able to bring back the Colorado River from extinction, and the Merrimack and the Wild Ohio. So environmentalists in the old hopeful American grain like to think. Much as I would like to agree with these hopes, as an historian, I feel the powerful hand of the past still lying on the present, preventing radical change. I see 100 more dams on the Kennebec beyond Edwards Dam. And I see across the nation 100,000 other dams and other technological structures still standing. I see powerful entrenched interest. And I see firmly rooted attitudes of conquest. I see growing populations that demand more and more from the natural environment. I also see that empires over nature, and this may be more true of empires over nature than political empires, can have exceptionally long lives. They are not easy to overthrow or to abolish. And I begin to wonder whether China's example of successive dynasties may prove very relevant to America, not irrelevant to the self-styled creative society that we like to think we are. So very different from that country. In the case of China, we have a long-lasting tradition of commanding and controlling water, one that is now more than 2,000 years old. It has survived through one group of rulers after another. China's philosophers and engineers may have disagreed over the strategies of control or even over the ends of that water control. Yet the empire has expanded and persisted. A flood sweeps away the dikes, and 100,000 laborers rush out to put them back again. Canals clog and fill with silt, and the nation dredges them clean again. Once in place, the hydraulic structures of control have a tendency to endure through the vicissitudes of political and social change. A dam or a canal may go out of use, but the empire over nature becomes a way of life that defends itself tenaciously against change. So too may be the future of the American conquest of this once wild and unruly continent. The control we have achieved will not be easily relinquished. Millions of people have settled in floodplains, expecting government to protect them. Or they've moved into the desert, expecting water to flow to their factories, to their faucets, to their swimming pools. Desert metropolises as large as Los Angeles, Phoenix, Las Vegas, their total population cannot be less than 15 million, depend utterly on the managed flow of the Colorado River and other western rivers. Agricultural, industrial interest demand more water than ever and more electricity, and they are in a powerful position to get their demands fulfilled. We also have inherited, it seems to me, a structure of power as well as a standard of consumption over the natural world that we are unlikely to give up anytime soon. However, we may like to think about and believe in our talent for creative destruction. The past controls us more than we want to admit. I want to grant that there are possibilities for change in the way in which we manage water in North America. I want to grant that we may clean up rivers better than we have done. I want to grant that we may tear down a dam that is no longer useful. We may, in selected places, even restore some portion of the devastated salmon and shad runs or preserve remnants of a lost America. But we also must realize that the history of any empire is a history of resistance to sweeping changes. It is a history of profound inertia. And the dreams of truly radical change are only dreams and not realities. Thank you very much.